I'm so delighted to be here on a wonderful cusp of spring morning on a sunny day, and it's a perfect time to think about native plants, gardening, and most importantly, gardening with native plants. I think all of you are aware of what a wonderful part of the world this is and the diversity of our wildflowers and native plants in the southern Appalachians. And so by gardening here and being in a sense of place, we can really make that happen in our own landscapes, in our communities, or other places that we garden and add plants to. Now, I've been thinking about meadows really for decades in varying forms. When you think about meadows, I was reflecting yesterday as I'm thinking about this program, meadows are kind of a human construct. You know, doesn't that have a nice, we talk about prairies and grasslands. Meadows have a really lovely, when you think of full of flowery meadows, and you hope, that you can have a magical meadow that you sprinkle out seeds and whoop, you have a perfect meadow. Now, about 30 years ago was the advent of the meadow in the can. Anyone have a failed version of that? There are lots of failed versions of that, and I was walking with a friend yesterday, and I was telling her about, I was going to talk about pocket meadows, and she said, our meadow didn't work, and she went on to her long litany of why it didn't continue. That's why I'm talking about pocket meadows today, not large, big meadows, which are very manageable and very doable, but they take work. This was the front of our first meadow. Actually, it wasn't. It was our second meadow attempt. But down in the Piedmont, we bought an old house that was 1.5 acres of lawn. What do two plant ecologists want to do with a lawn? Well, and you can see up here in this upper version there was a Chinese privet there, a scruffy old rose, and some lawn. Well, we set aside, and this was Tim and a much younger guys here, and some of you may have heard him speak recently. We started plugging in plants to create a meadow, and this was probably in that scene was probably one of its best years, following a whole lot of rain. Meadows are grasslands and flowers in general are always undergoing change. One of the things I like to point out with gardening programs is that plants are not like our interior landscapes. Shrubs are not couches. They change, they grow, right? You know, they don't just sit there and don't move until you do something. And we often think about our landscapes a bit like that.
Could you speak up?
I'll do my best. So this is what this meadow looked like one fall. You can see the Indian grass there that looks so pretty at that time of year. And this may not be what you envision as a pocket meadow. It's a bit bigger than what you might consider a pocket-sized. Here's a different kind of garden planting that evokes a meadow feeling, not in my own garden, but in somewhere else. But you can see the combination of perennials, Amsonia, and other grasses that create that meadowy effect. This is the front of our Asheville house a couple of years ago. And I'll talk... We escaped our lawn when we moved to Asheville, but I'll show you, if there's time at the end, how this started out from nothing but mulch. We didn't do this from lawn. We did it from mulch, or I did it from mulch. And you can see this kind of planting, this was the end of July, if I come in and pull into the garden, I am a happy camper when I see this. Not everyone would be happy with it, but it makes me happy and Tim likes it too. So let's think about what's a meadow. I already mentioned what it may not be. It's kind of a human construct. It almost always involves wildflowers. And I brought along, I just was reminded of this, a wonderful book that is titled Wildflower Wonders, the 50 Best Wildflower Sites in the World. This is literally, I was flipping through this and boy, can I go to the Dolomites? Can I go to South Africa? The wildflower sites that we think about that are wonderful, if you could go out to see the desert super bloom this year, wouldn't that be fabulous? These meadows that we think about full of wildflowers are, let me just briefly go into this brief. We don't have, in the East, we call our meadow environments, these grassland environments, we call them meadows. We could call them prairies if we're in the central part of the country. Similar kinds of habitats, grassland habitats that have lots of wildflowers in them. And these sites in other parts of the world are also wildflower rich with lots of diversity because of continuous disturbance of usually of some sort, whether it's grazing or fire. Those are the two most common. So here's a subalpine meadow in Austria many years ago, maintained by dairy cattle. And you can see Tim again and a much younger guys. We literally couldn't get past, it took us so long to walk just a mile. We were just entranced by this place, Oberstdorf in Austria. Similarly, it was in July, I think. Yeah. Here on the slopes of Mount Hood in Oregon, this kind of wildflower array is maintained because it's of this rocky subsoil. You can see how I was scrambling around in this scree slope. Probably very ephemeral, very changing. Who knows? Here in the Apalachicola National Forest in northern Florida, this is a wonderfully wildflower-rich array of species this is a fire-maintained habitat. So in a wet meadow, there are orchids and bog plants and various other things there. And some of you may be familiar with our longleaf pine savanna meadows in sort of grassland areas. So you think about, as we think about meadows, pocket meadows, those kinds of plantings, think about how you manage the change in those settings, whether it's a larger one or not. One of the things that is interesting to think about in prairies and in many plant communities, you have different root depths that complement one another. So if we're trying to mix, and some of you may be dealing with pastures that you want to try to convert to a more meadowy habitat, but the depth of those roots and whether they're European pasture grasses or whether they're native is really important as you work to balance your plantings. I'll just leap forward in a little story. Some of you know compass plant or prairie dock, these very, very tall prairie plants. Well, I had what I thought was a really brilliant idea. I will plant a prairie dock in the middle of my pocket meadow. I was admiring it on the Greenway on Weaver Boulevard in Asheville. On the Greenway, it's a well-behaved, smaller plant because it's stuck in the middle of the median. It really likes the pocket meadow. and then I went to the Garden Bloggers Fling a couple of years back in DC. One of the gardens we visited had like 3 prairie docks. They were taller than I was and about this wide, each one of them, and I thought, And my garden blogging friends from Chicago, and they were going, you want to deadhead every single, flower, or you will be sorry. And I'm like, uh-oh. Anyway, well, we'll see how it works. So I want to just emphasize here, plants, gardens, and natural landscapes are always changing. Now here you might think, oh, this is a pretty nice planting. This is actually a North American prairie-inspired planting in central Germany. Hermannshof. Unbelievably gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful plants. You'll notice these are purple coneflower heads. Notice how they don't have any scruffy leaves on the stems, so they look just gorgeous. That's editing. So don't think you just plant this stuff and it stays like this. And this is and these next images I'll talk a bit more about that. So my pocket idea here is basically inspired by pocket plantings. These I saw at a B&B in England some years ago, these little small pocket patches. How delightful is that in a patio? So you've got these little sedums planted within that patio. To the left here, that's a tucked in along a sidewalk planting, a pocket planting if you were, at an automotive garage. When was the last time you went to get your car fixed and there were plantings next to it? Yeah. We have work to do in this country. So just a couple more examples. So this is what I'm thinking about. I know big meadows are hard to manage. Let's think, how do I make a smaller meadow? How do I do that better? These are tucked in median plantings, what sometimes are called hell strips, which is sort of a weird name for these plantings between the sidewalk and the road. But give you the idea of how you could tuck in, this doesn't matter what kinds of plants are in those. These aren't native plants, but now let's look at some of the inspirations and ways people have carried out planting. Sometimes these are really big plantings that we can scale down to a smaller scale. Here's a native habitat. If some of you, the North Carolina Botanical Gardens, coastal plain habitat, it's actually maintained through burning, which is a little tricky in a lot of our neighborhoods. But what you do instead of burning is either bush hogging or clipping or editing in some other way. This is out west, a combination of, as you can see, an edge of a more informal planting going on to grassland. The kinds of scenes that we think about, here a meadow that, notice the very tightly edged path that's been clipped there that gives it a sense of definition. That's probably one of the keys to having a pocket planting or a more informal planting. I heard a really well-known garden speaker, Claudia West, recently talking about informal plantings, and she was very interesting. She's a very ecologically oriented gardener, and some of you may have heard her. She showed a photograph of something that looked very much like the front pocket meadow that I showed you a minute or two ago. and said, well, these can be kind of informal looking, and I'm thinking, I kind of like this one. And, but her husband was apparently a neat and orderly gardener, and she said, I'd be divorced if I had this in my front yard. And I thought, that's interesting. But there's often, it's definition that makes all the difference. It's an idea that you have actually taken care of it. And I told you already about the editing of those purple coneflower heads. Some of you have been to the Lurie Garden in Chicago in Millennium Park. It's such an amazing place, just amazing. It's right in the center of Chicago. Pete Aldolf, who's a naturalistic garden designer, very well known from the Netherlands, designed it using our native perennials from our prairies and our eastern plant palettes, our perennials, that many of them have been embraced by European garden designers in a big way. So it's just amazing to see that. And think about some of the cultivars of some of what are standard garden perennials that are natives, often have German or Dutch cultivar names, and they've gone to Europe and come back to us. Sarah Price, for the London Olympics, inspired by our North American prairies, just beautiful garden design. So these are inspirations for what we can do in these informal plantings. These are meadow plantings, and these are not pocket plantings, but any kind of version of this, boy, I'd love to look out at that. And these take some design and some management. All gardens take editing and gardening. You don't just throw them out there and leave them. They are always changing. Now, I don't remember where I took this photo, but you'll recognize our Joe Pye, right? Doesn't it look neat and tidy? I mean, it looks robust. It's not flopping over, and it's not 12 feet tall. These are some sort of shorter selection, and I'll talk a bit more about that. You can see it looks like a hyssop here on the right, another one of our native plants, and probably a veronicastrum or something in the way back. Just a final inspiration. I was very fortunate a few years back to be able to visit Pete Aldolf and his wife Anya's private garden. It was open to the public for open garden days in the fall. He not only designed the Lurie Garden, but he also was one of the visionaries behind the High Line design. If some of you have been to the High Line in New York City, his garden is their garden is truly remarkable. Whether this is an aesthetic that you like or not, I was just absolutely blown away by the sheer architecture of it, and the way that he's using these drifts of grasses, many of these very tall plants like the Joe Pye here in this image, in very, very impressive plantings. He started out as a designer using a lot of clipped yew hedges, very structured hedges, but as he and his wife ran a nursery for decades in the Netherlands, and he started doing more designs and fell in love with our native plants in North America, it became increasingly more naturalistic. But this kind of planting is very much also maintained. And another thing I realized visiting his garden, this was the same trip I visited the one in Germany, these plants are also edited. Edited, I just mean they're garden, they're weeded. I'm not sure if I'm not showing. I had another image, it's not in this particular program, but the dead leaves on these stalks have been taken off to keep that strong sculptural form. And if you think about it, if you think about using your own gardens, if you have any kind of garden, what I often talk about is if you're looking at it and that, let's say something stops your eye and it's scruffy and ugly, get rid of it. And it's amazing how just one little snip will do it. You don't have to cut it all back. So you might have thought, oh, that's a really ugly old Angelica stalk. Well, when you take off the old ugly leaves, it's really attractive. You know, it's making a winter statement. And one thing that Pete Aldolf really focuses on is as you're working with plants, in these native plants in your meadows, as you're working with plants in your designs, embrace their entire life cycle. You know, think about those dead stalks and their sculptural qualities just as much as the flower color or the foliage color. Closer to home, little patches along the Blue Ridge Parkway can be great inspirations. This one is near Craigie Gardens. I think the next one is as well. Phlox, butterfly weed, yarrow, looks like coreopsis. You know, these are the standard perennials that we like to grow, many of us like to grow in our gardens, maintained simply by mowing. So these are native plants maintained by mowing, keeping the weeds at bay. Now, this is probably, what a lovely little pocket planting this is. This was up in Minneapolis. You can see the blazing star in the middle, some phlox, some coreopsis. What I like to point out is the common milkweed. You see the common milkweed? I don't have a pointer here, but that's popped up. Any of you grown common milkweed? You know that it doesn't stay neat and tidy like that for long, right? You know, edited. This gardener was pulling out extra stems. It's also confined by the sidewalk and the asphalt. But this was a very artfully maintained little garden, because it's it's got a really pleasing form. So she wasn't letting that milkweed overcome that patch. Here's another sort of informal planting. This one was very interesting in Germany, in this median, where they're using dryland meadowy plants. And I don't think this lasted very long, but it was certainly striking to see right near the train station. Another edge planting, also in Germany, near in a subdivision essentially, but very, very informal. That evokes a meadow to me. So what I'm thinking about in these projects is really, how do we evoke that sense of meadow in a garden setting? Very patterned one. A number of European designers are using fairly specialized wildflower seed mixes to try to create patterns like this. This is not very naturalistic, but it's certainly better than a lot of median plantings. And how delightful is this? A little meadowy enclave surrounded by lawn in an otherwise very formal English garden. You'd have to, I don't know, I thought this was just really delightful. And here, some of you may recognize this if you get to Asheville or live in Asheville. This is the median, or the roundabout entrance to University of North Carolina, Asheville, off Weaver Boulevard. It's simply just grasses. It's just really attractive. And when Antler Hill Village at Biltmore Estate was first put in, they left the parking area with these meadow patches. So they didn't last, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years, and probably decided the aesthetic wasn't quite spiffy enough for Biltmore. But they're now just mowed, much to my dismay. But this was a nice way to do it temporarily by having a mowed edge. Very, I thought it looked pretty good. So let's talk about how we can put together a mix of native plants to create some sort of meadow that would be appropriate. This was a short-term solution at the Botanical Garden where I used to work. You can see the trees that were cut down, they went into decline, took them out, and so one of our horticulturalists took Muhlenbergia, the purple flowered grass there, and some other grasses, and just put it in, and it really was a very effective way to do something with that kind of ugly little spot short term. So just by popping in some grasses, not wildflowers, but grasses, that was a way to handle that. Back to Asheville and the Greenway meadow plantings, some of them are more constrained than others. They don't have quite the people power to really to always do the editing that might be needed to fulfill everyone's aesthetic sense. But they're very impressive, as are the parking areas at the Botanical Gardens of Asheville, which is a wonderful little native plant garden that's over 50 years old now. They also are a little challenged in terms of time that they can spend maintaining those gardens. Even though I'm a passionate lover of native plants, I have a little bit of trouble with that lower image looking quite balanced enough. It's a little bit too jumbly in terms of the ecological constraint of that. But that's how we as gardeners, it's up to us and what our vision of what we want it to look like come in. Ditto with this. Wonderful plants, just needs a little editing to bring it back into balance. But great combinations of plants to use. This was what my pocket meadow looked like early on. It's now about, I think, 10 years old. It's changed a lot. Every year is different. This was a small version of it. Let's go on now to talk about how we do this. We can, meadows, and for plants to flower well, they almost always need sun if they're meadow and prairie wildflowers, at least 6 hours. So if you have afternoon sun, that's going to be better than morning sun, but you do need sun. You can do woodland edges. There are wildflowers that do well in woodland edges. Depending on whether the site's wet or dry will determine what plants you want to choose for those sites. You know, it's easy for me to stick on a image here, start with an open site that is without weeds. Right? Well, it's hard to start with a site without weeds unless you're in a total open spot. But that is your sort of first thing to try to do. And one of the reasons an awful lot of meadow attempts, shall we say, fail. It's because the weeds have not been dealt with up front, or they're not managed as quickly as they need to be going forward. I wanted to mention, this is one of my new favorite books, and when we downsized, boy, it was strict. It was like one book it has to go before one comes in, and only the best books came with me from Clemson to Asheville. But this book got a special spot because it's called Garden Revolution, How Our Landscapes Can Be a Source of Environmental Change. Larry Wagner, some of you may know of him, is a really well-known expert on large-scale meadows up in the Northeast. He does huge landscapes. He has in this book a really excellent description of how to manage larger scale meadows, but what he emphasizes, first of all, is to start with a weed-free space. He pleads with people, you know, if you aren't going to use some kind of herbicide, use smothering, and you've got to smother it for at least a year to get rid of the disease, and then try to plant without disturbing the soil. You don't want to, you know, get these annual weeds stirred up again, or the perennial ones, even worse. But he also talks very much about how those a lot of meadows fail early on because they're not weeded properly in the first couple of years. Also, that the mix of annuals and perennials is not appropriate for the site. Perennials that are longer lived are the key to really longevity of any sort in these kinds of plantings. And those of you that are gardeners in general, I could be talking about other kinds of plants too, but perennial borders are most similar. These are not natives, but mixing plants that mimic nature is a real key. So if I'm adding something more into a meadowy environment, I'm very much thinking about where is it going to be the balance. I succumbed to getting a prairie dock because I had lost a really tall coreopsis in the middle of that pocket meadow, and I really liked the way that vertical form was. So now I have a really, really big prairie dock there. And it's seeded more of them. Uh-oh. Anyway, so I always like to show this particular slide because it emphasizes this gardener's rule that I'm sure many of you have learned for years of match plants to the site and soil conditions. This is true of your meadowy areas too, or your pocket meadows or not. Now, this was a big oak tree behind that bird bath. Why would I think the bird bath was going to be enough moisture to keep that lobelia alive? That was delusional. I did not match the site to the soil conditions, so anyway, I enjoyed it for a year. Grasses, herbaceous perennials, and are what we're going to be plugging into this pocket meadow site. And these are natives here. Here are some of the kinds of plants that, depending on whether it's wet or dry, you might want to include. These are largely, a number of these are wetter species, such as the cardinal flower and rose turtlehead chalome, the marsh milkweed, but then the liatris, the blazing stars, the New England asters, those are tough plants. Golden Alexander, is that an underused plant in our meadow areas. So the idea is that these are the kinds of plants to mix together. And what I'm going to do now is just talk about some of these individual plants and think about how, when you're making these meadows, you're mixing and matching. And I should make just a side note. This presentation, along with the list of plants that I have recommended for pollinator plantings, which are very similar to these pocket meadow plantings, are on the sidebar of my blog site, Natural Gardening, so you can go to my blog site and download the PDF and the plant list if you want to look at it, or look at this program again. There are also a bunch of other talks there too to look at if you want. So those of you that are already gardeners with these perennials, and I hope there are many of you in that category, look at, these are familiar plants to put together. Butterfly weed, coreopsis, coneflowers, boneset, maybe less common, blazing star, those liatris, spicata cultivars are everywhere in our garden centers. Penstemon, beard tongue, is a great plant. Mountain mints, they're less common, but boy, are they pollinator magnets. They add this sort of wonderful, airy look. In a meadow, you might not buy one simply to put out in your formal perennial garden, but boy, they're killer mixed in with other perennials. I love black-eyed Susans, both the perennial ones and the annuals. You can move them around. They self-seed, moves them in the back, or not give them away, whatever, if you have extras. I'm not sure, the Prairie Doc story hasn't quite finished yet. I'm not sure I would always recommend it. But my problem is that I have a very fertile site. Our meadow plants, our prairie plants, really want relatively infertile sites mostly, these native plants. They don't want a bunch of extra nitrogen. The reason our blazing star, do some of you grow those in your gardens? Do they flop over? It's in very fertile sites is where they flop over. If they're in less fertile, drier sites, they stay upright. So instead of propping them up everywhere, you can do that. Goldenrod. There are beautiful goldenrods out there. There are also tall, rangy ones. I went to a state garden in England on one trip. I couldn't believe it. It was Solidago canadensis, the super, super tall one. And it was there right by some huge hydrangeas that had all the, and I'm thinking, well, if they have this in a National Trust garden, then what's our problem with goldenrods? But goldenrods can be really extremely great in gardens. Asters, they used to be asters, but now they're an unpronounceable genus. And Zizzy, as I mentioned. In wetter sites, Joe Pye, lobelia, cardinal flower, phlox, bee balm, ironweed are all wonderful choices. Joe Pye's now, you can buy much smaller cultivars that are more manageable. Butterfly weed is much more widely available than it used to be because of the milkweeds being host plants for monarchs. Common milkweed is more used by monarchs in this part of the east, but they do use butterfly weed too in the central U.S. This is a great plant for all sorts of pollinators, very deep taproot, quite reliable. Snakeroot penstemon is a widely available garden plant native to this area in our prairies. This is Penstemon digitalis, and one of the reasons I like it is it's got an evergreen rosette. So when you have otherwise a fairly bare patch or bare area in the winter, the rosettes will show up. And I already talked about blazing stars. I think these are I just love these plants. We've got about 6 different native species. This one on the far right is one of the ones that you see in rock outcrops. Spicata, as I already mentioned, is the one that you probably see in cultivation the most often. They produce the corms of them in huge, huge numbers in Holland and in the Netherlands each year, and we get them back in bags or in pots or whatever. Rattlesnake master on the left is a very characteristic plant of our sort of remnant Piedmont prairies here in the east, also in prairie habitats. Coreopsis, lots of coreopsis out there. Different species, easy to get in pots. Purple coneflower, there's also a couple of other coneflowers that are nice to use. This is the species where we certainly see some very weird ones that have been selected that don't look right in a meadow environment at all to me, but so closest to species you're going to feel best about it, I think. But here you can notice the Rudbeckia, a selection along with this rather large bone set, which you probably wouldn't pick out as a plant by itself to think, oh, I want to put that in my pot in the front of the house. But together, I just really enjoyed looking at this, enjoyed watching all of the pollinators visit these flowers, looked at the size of them as we, in front. It's just really fun. Here are black-eyed Susans. I think most of us, they're very widely used. There's some very large flowered cultivars of Rudbeckia fulgida, which start looking a little bit less natural to me, but they could be fairly good meadow competitors too. The species are probably going to work the best. Herta is an annual, so the life cycle is not quite as long. This is one of my favorite goldenrods, the fireworks, that has a very graceful shape. Yarrow, we have native versions of, very nice plant to incorporate into a meadow mix. And I'm not really talking a lot in this program about designing your meadow, because that's really going to be a matter of what your site is, how many plants you plant, how you think about what you want it to look like, how it changes over time, whether a deer comes by and eats all the Rudbeckias or the rabbit picks them out. That's the fun of gardening and managing these kinds of plantings. Golden fleece is another solidago that is kind of this clustery inflorescence, very nice. You can see that big, tall rattlesnake master behind. Sunflowers, our perennial sunflowers are great. New England aster, New York asters. Some of those can be managed with height by clipping them down in June. May try that with the prairie dock, see if I can keep it smaller. But with asters, sometimes they'll flop over too, but if you prune them back to get them to bunch out a little bit, they still look really natural and keep their size. And this is all in the guise of what I would describe as fun gardening. Right? This is just kind of going out there with your clippers and clipping things back, or thinking, oh, I'll just strip off those dead leaves. That was easy. This is not hard work. This is fun, and they're in your garden. Aster, aromatic aster is a great plant for this area. It stays low. It flowers in October, and it just is a pollinator attractant, all kinds of native bees, butterflies, etc. Ironweed, we have both our native species, a couple of our native species that are super tall in ditches, but there are other species from the Midwest that are shorter. Joe Pies, now you can buy Little Joe, Baby Joe. They're not truly miniature, but they're smaller than straight species. And Joe Pye is also a butterfly magnet. Here's a smaller version of Joe Pye here at the Highlands Performing Arts Center, and it was not very tall at all. It was really a charming small plant. Some of you may already, Blue Star is become much more widely available than it used to be, has wonderful fall color, can be mixed in, these kinds of mixed pocket meadow plantings. Bee balm, if you have a bit of moisture, is ideal, both the Monarda fistulosa, which is blue, and then Didyma that's bright red. I might mention too the color palette. You know, I'm trying to garden for pollinators in my pocket meadow from as early as I can in the growing season. So in, say, May might be the first time I see flowers, all the way till frost. So you're wanting to provide something in flower to provide nectar or pollen throughout the growing season. So by thinking about these plants, and there's great planting plans out there, you know, you're trying to have something in flower throughout by also balancing color and height and availability of flowers. I heard a really great plantsman speak a couple of years ago who talked about our gardens being really like a piece of music. Notes come and go. We're putting together how those notes come and go. And that's part of the artistry of the gardens are always changing. And that's really what you're doing if you're trying, you know, they're not couches. They're changing. But just a couple of grasses, Indian grass, little blue stem, both great grasses. Indian grass can get quite big and seed around, but if you have lots of space. So to end up here, I'm going to just show you the progression, and hopefully this will feel encouraging to you from what this pocket meadow in front of our house, how its progression has been. And I really believe in smaller meadow spots, it's best to use plants, either container-grown plants, or increasingly, we can buy plants in plugs as mixes from different nurseries. And some of you, I'm sure, get Wildflower Farm's catalog. Old style, mainstream, famous nursery in Connecticut. I was so thrilled to get this a week or two ago. I open it up, and among all these other plants I don't particularly like, I'm like, plant a ready-made buffet for pollinators. And I see new Native Meadow Garden. This is from Wildflower Farm. And I read it, and I'm like, 5 plants of each of 10 varieties. Plants, they're in rooted plugs in a plant plug tray, and they send it to you pre-organized. And I'm thinking, wow, sign me up. And I go on and I see, oh, you mean they also have a butterfly, perennial, and shrub garden. I guess the Wildflower Farm catalog just had gone in the recycling bin straight away, and I just happened to look at it. And so they have all these pre-packaged plug trays. There are other, and I had not paid a lot of attention. And other nurseries like Prairie Moon Nursery is a Midwestern nursery. They also are shipping plants in plug trays, and you're customizing your mixes. And what plug trays are long, are deep, narrower plugs. So they're very, and that's how our nursery growers get plants to grow out and sell to us at BB Barnes or wherever. They get them in plugs and plant them up. But you can actually, it didn't strike me as outrageously expensive to get a This is Prairie Moon Nursery. There are others that are like this, but this is nice because they market to people like us, not wholesalers, is what I'm trying to say, is you as a consumer can order these plug trays. So for a relatively modest cost, you know, in the grand scheme of things, you can plant a pretty large little garden. So that's what we started with. Now, we first bought our little house in Asheville thinking that we loved Asheville, we'd like to go up there. We wanted a low maintenance landscape. And we still have a low maintenance landscape. Two plant people do not drive up on the weekend and want to look at that. Right? You know, it's like, blah. And we already covered the gravel, gray gravel, with this mulch. So, and planted a little sedum garden there. So, you can see behind Tim and to the right of Mocha how that's the site of where the pocket meadow is that I showed you. And I guess Tim was working on the sedum garden right there. So slowly plugging in plants, and you can see all it was mulch on top of the most dreadful looking clay that you dug down into it, and it was like this gray slimy stuff that who knows where they found it for this house. So you plug that in. Here I'm coming back from a native plant sale thinking, oh, I'm going to shove this in somewhere. And I'd like to tell the story about that particular little helianthus. I got this at the Botanical Garden of Asheville, it's one of their vendors, and the cultivar was table rock. And I thought, I said, is this table rock down in South Carolina, you know? And she said, probably. So I go back home and I have it. I'm Googling table rock with this cultivar. It's in New Zealand. So it's a hybrid. This was a hybrid of two of our native helianthus species that was selected by a New Zealand nursery person. And so I buy it from a native plant vendor, you know, in Asheville. But
oh well.
Yeah, oh well is right. So here's this meadow in a fairly early stage. You can see we were dragging plants up from Clemson. It looks like I have a stack of books in the back of my car. You know, here we are. It's coming along here. This is summer of 2011. We bought the house in 2008. So things grew quickly. Here's my coreopsis that I loved, the height of that. It was beautiful, when it was in flower, it was gorgeous. It disappeared. I don't know if a vole ate it or it didn't like the conditions that year. But gradually, and this is confined by that mulch and the path to the front door. So here it's coming along, again, September 2011, May 2014, so this is when it's coming up early on. These are the zizias and the penstemon digitalis. This reminds me too. This is a plant called golden ragwort. Any of you have that plant? It's a great ground cover, not in the pocket meadow. It's evergreen, it spreads, it's native, it's fabulous, and it's about to flower right now, but it was going to take over the meadow. So it got banished to the back and is ready to pop up back there. That was, you know, so there's also mistakes to be made. So coming along here, and this was late July 2017. So I'm waiting right now. It doesn't look like much of anything. You know, normally I would have done my best to have structural form over the winter. You know, the goldfinches eat the seeds and that kind of thing. You remember that snow we had in December? It just flattened everything, and there was no way. So I've just bundled up those stems that may have larvae in them of cavity nesting bees, and we put them back in the back landscape, and hopefully that's all fine. But things are just now coming up here at the end of March. So I hope that this has been a little bit of a inspiration to think about how to use some of these plants in your landscape, and there's nothing that I like to think about. The process of gardening as essentially being fun. I did a program a couple of weeks ago that I got recruited to do at the Arboretum. It was called Spring Gardening Tasks. It talked, so this generic description talks about pruning and fertilizing and all the things we do in American garden writing, talking about chores, spring yard work. What you want to do is create gardens that make you happy, that welcome you home, that don't make you feel like you have to leap out of your chair and run out and do something. These kinds of naturalistic plantings, whether it's pocket meadows or native shrubs and trees, they don't require the back-breaking kind of gardening that we sometimes think about as being unfun. You get rid of the lawnmower, you get rid of the pruners, at least too much about it. And by creating these gardens, and what Tim and I were looking to do is to surround ourselves in this little infill house in Asheville with a sense of the mountains. We love that, and we look back into a forest behind that we've pulled out all these invasives. I should say, not we, Tim has. But essentially, that was our aesthetic. And so as you work with your gardens and your community plantings in places like that, I think the idea of trying to rewild our landscapes in our gardens, use our native plants like in these kinds of ways, is something that can be a really useful and good thing to do.